Hi, thank you so much, everybody, for being here and viewing our presentation of all the other options that you had. We're grateful to be here and grateful to have you here. My friend Kailey and I are going to give a presentation today on when loss goes unrecognized within the context of sexual violence. So grief and women's mental health care. My name is Shannon O'Mara. I am a counselor trainee at the University of Akron in Akron, Ohio, and a certified peer recovery supporter through the Ohio Department of Behavioral Health. Kaylee, do you want to introduce yourself?
I would love to. Thank you, my friend. So I am Dr. Kailey Bradley, licensed professional clinical counselor here in the state of Ohio. Also have supervisory designation and have a love, passion, background, all the things working in the field of bereavement. So we're super excited to be here.
Absolutely. And just a disclaimer regarding this topic, when we refer to women with regard to sexual violence, we're referring to anyone who identifies as a woman, whether you are cisgender, transgender, as well as any other identity, gender identity. We know that cisgender men, non-binary individuals are also impacted by sexual violence. And while this presentation is more so focused on women's mental health for the purpose of the conference, we just want to share that as well as just the disclaimer as well that we want to raise general awareness that marginalized communities such as the LGBTQIA plus community, people of color, are disproportionately impacted by sexual violence. And while we might not be going as into the statistics within this presentation, we do just want to make that known. So I will get us started with our learning objectives. So by the end of this presentation, you all will be able to determine, ideally, at least three losses that women experience after enduring sexual violence. Recognize at least three ways that disenfranchised grief in particular can impact women recovering from sexual violence, and apply at least four survivor-centered, trauma-informed strategies that ethically validate the grief survivors face and support their reclamation of voice, autonomy, and safety. So, to get us started, I just wanted to outline a few ways in which women and girls are affected by sexual violence. So, I first have childhood sexual abuse, or CSA, as we might refer to it throughout the presentation. This can look like many different things. This can look like molestation or inappropriate touching of the body. It can look like rape, forced penetration, exposure to pornography, which is a crime against children. And it can look like incest, where somebody in the family is having inappropriate relations with the person or the survivor, I should say. In general, as well, sexual violence can look like rape, so forced penetration of any part of the body, vaginally, orally, anally, by another person's body or a foreign object. It can look like sexual assault, being touched, groped in any way that is inappropriate and without consent given. It can look like sexual harassment, somebody not feeling comfortable in their place of work or in their home or in any other environment due to comments or actions that are related to sexual harassment. We think about digitally based offenses that could look like revenge porn, where somebody may have consented to their picture being taken in a sexual position at one point, and then after a breakup, for example, somebody releases that picture without the person's consent. We can also think about deep fakes and how that's on the rise. Indecent exposure, this could look like flashing, reproductive coercion when women are forced to carry a child or an unwanted pregnancy whether that's through the means of breaking a condom or hiding contraception, various means. And we can also think about human trafficking. I put two terms that this can look like, sex trafficking, forced prostitution, although there's also labor trafficking, but in this case, we're thinking specifically about sex trafficking. And when we think about the various impacts that sexual violence can have on women, this list does not do it justice, but I do want to get a little bit into some of the things that women face as we introduce the topic of grief later in our session. So we think about physical impacts. There could be various injuries, whether it's bruising around the body, whether it's genital injury. We can think about sexually transmitted infections and unwanted pregnancy, kind of like we talked about with reproductive coercion or as a byproduct of a sexual assault or rape. We can think about relational impacts, so decreased trust in others. Imagining, for instance, in a case of incest or in a case of an acquaintance or a family friend or just a close friend of any sort being the perpetrator, that can, without a doubt, impact our trust in the people around us. And even if it is a stranger, that can still make us afraid of the world and everybody around us, as well as various effects on intimacy. You know, some survivors respond by not wanting to engage in their sexuality, not finding pleasure when they do engage in their sexuality, or engaging in their sexuality frequently as a trauma response to what they've endured. And we can also think about the psychological impacts. So, post-traumatic stress, this can look like hypervigilance or nightmares, intrusive memories, and as well as guilt, shame, stigmatization, both self-stigmatization and stigmatization faced by society at large, police officers, doctors, parents, anyone. And there's so many other psychological impacts as well. We think about substance use, non-suicidal self-injury, disordered eating, anxiety, depression. So many of these things correlate with experiences of sexual violence. And I also forgot to mention that according to one of the articles we referenced, Muldoon et al., 1 in 3 women experience some form of sexual violation. And something else I wanted to bring up was other hardships that are faced by survivors. Victim blaming. How many times have we heard a woman being judged for what they wore, or how late they were out at night, or them walking around alone? How many times have we heard accusations of lying from various points of concern, whether that is law enforcement, judicially, the family, a friend, a partner? We can also think about how survivors are degraded and even threatened in person and on social media. I mean, imagine being somebody in a high profile case like what happened with Brett Kavanaugh and Christy Ford, where I don't even want to remember some of the vile things that were stated regarding her. And as well, we can consider deciding whether to seek medical attention or pursue legal action. You know, we want to support survivors' autonomy, and at the same time, sometimes people might insist that engage in certain, they pursue certain care or engage in certain processes. And while we want them to receive justice and medical care, it's really difficult to feel like they're being forced to do that. And so that's a consideration we want to bring up, as well as potential criminal charges. You know, if someone was a minor and they engaged in substance use, then they might be charged for that. Someone might be charged for public intoxication or falsifying a report. There's a documentary that I just watched, Victim Suspect, I think it's called,
Mm.
where one second somebody's reporting a rape, and then the next minute they're in handcuffs because the police don't necessarily want to investigate further. They have a notion that they don't believe the survivor. And of course, that's not every single law enforcement officer, judge, doctor, but just these are very real fears that these women are facing, as well as the idea of disclosing the abuse to anybody, loved ones especially, is such a harrowing task. And it could even drive somebody towards suicidal ideation, which I didn't mention in the psychological impacts because I wanted it to be very clear here that it is very common for people who have faced violation, as well as many of the losses that we're going to talk about in just a second, one slide away, that that the loss of identity or the loss of trust in others or agency can lead someone to want to lose their life. And this is not just a moment in someone's life. This can have years-long consequences on so many things. And so we just want everyone to be mindful of that as we move into our grief conversation.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Shannon. You did such a good job of kind of just painting the picture of the very complex reality, right, that survivors are navigating. Um, as I kind of hinted out, one of my kind of life missions is to create what I call grief literate and grief informed societies where we talk about loss, both death and non-death loss, right? And as Shannon and I were planning this presentation and some other work we're doing together, we've talked a lot about the intersection of grief-informed care and trauma-informed care and the losses that are endured by survivors. So a loss of safety. I think Shannon did a great job describing that, right? Is the world safe? And how do I navigate the world post this traumatic incident? Loss of autonomy, personal agency, interpersonal agency, sexual agency, loss of trust, again, in self and in others. How do I navigate even bigger existential kind of things, right? Loss of the world and God are a good place or are a good concept, and then loss of identity, right? So there's so many losses interwoven. And I think we have to have that grief informed lens when we work with these survivors. You want to keep on chugging along there for me.
I'm trying. It's
That's
just not
okay.
being
It's
nice to me.
okay. Technology is always an adventure. I totally
It
get
surely is.
it.
That's all right. I will attempt to share again.
Reshare. That'll work. That'll work.
Exactly. Apologies for that.
Good. All good.
All right, let's see. All right, let's keep her moving.
This looks promising. There we go. Beautiful. Thank you, Shannon. So, disenfranchised grief is a term I jokingly said to Shannon. I said, don't let me talk about this because I could talk for hours and hours. But it's a really beautiful, validating, I call it kind of an umbrella term for any loss that gets minimized, stigmatized, or not acknowledged. And non-death loss is often disenfranchised, right? We often, when we think about death loss, which is hard enough as it is, right? So this is not to minimize death loss, but we do have a sense of ritual, right? We have funerals. We have these touch points and touchstones to make sense of our loss. I often think with non-death losses and disenfranchised grief at large, we don't have that, right? And so we're kind of left kind of wandering in the wilderness, right? So to speak, because we don't have these rituals. There's a lack of support and validation, right? There's often this idea of, well, you didn't lose a person, right? I often will say disenfranchised grief is what I call an empathic failure, right? It's a lack of empathy. And unfortunately, we know that people navigating disenfranchised grief need support that much more, right? And so there's this paradox of these very minimized losses are then met with a lack of support, a lack of validation, and a lack of empathy. Keep on going here. There's so much more too that we could say in regards to disenfranchised grief. Um, Disenfranchised grief was a term developed by Dr. Ken Doka, if you're interested, in doing a little more research. Okay. I think, is this your slide, my friend, Shannon, clinical strategy? No, okay. I wasn't quite sure. That's okay. But the most, I think, often important thing we can do when we're navigating disenfranchised grief is providing language, right? And allowing our clients or our individuals that we're supporting to name those losses. Okay. Many survivors maybe haven't had this language. Like I kind of shared, maybe they're like, well, I didn't quote unquote lose somebody. So grief may not feel like, they've been really allowed to express that. We want to normalize grief responses. Okay. There's not one magic formula through the grief process. We all experience grief differently. Okay. So we want to normalize that alongside those trauma responses. We want to say, like, of course you're responding in that way, right? Of course you feel that. We want to support reclaiming the safety, voice, identity, and agency rather than, quote, returning to before. Okay. And I think that voice and agency are so important. And I think you alluded to this, Shannon. Sometimes that can be really challenging as the helper, right? We may feel like, oh gosh, I think this might be really helpful for you, or gosh, I think you should report. And while we can support and provide resources, I think sometimes we have to allow, especially, right, trauma survivors, the opportunity for them to craft their narrative and for them to decide how they want to move through that process. We want to be mindful of
Absolutely.
intersection. Oh, yeah, please, Shannon, jump in.
I was gonna say, the trauma-informed care principles, one of them is empowerment, voice, and choice.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so when you say reclaim, that makes me think a lot about empowerment, where we're offering
yeah,
those strategies. Like maybe you should go, maybe you could seek medical
yeah,
care, maybe you could report,
yeah.
maybe you could tell mom and dad, maybe you
Mhm.
could tell your partner, maybe you could tell
Yeah,
whoever or do
yeah,
whatever. But we want to offer options
yeah.
because
Mhm.
we don't want to force somebody
Yeah,
into a situation again that they
yeah,
don't want to be in.
yeah,
And
yeah.
another one of the SAMHSA's
Mhm.
trauma-informed care principles is that collaboration.
Yeah.
So we're working on that together in
Mhm.
a clinical sense, but I think that
Yeah.
that can extend far beyond counseling and can be in law enforcement, in the
Mhm.
justice system, in
Yeah.
medical care, friends, family. It can be anywhere. Just wanting to make
Yeah.
brief mention.
I love it. No, please. Yeah, I think that's so well said. And we want to be mindful of culturally responsive approaches, right? And being very culturally humble. I always say, teach me more about your lived reality, right? Tell me what this is like for you. We want to be mindful of intersectionality, right? How, interlocking identities shape, maybe how we have access to support, right? Um, and using creative,
Absolutely.
yeah.
And in addition, like we said earlier, certain communities are disproportionately affected by sexual violence. So
Mhm.
we think about the LGBTQIA plus community, for
Yeah.
example, imagining that somebody already faces such stigma and hardship and judgment at the hands of their family, and then to be violated on
Yeah.
top of that is just unimaginable.
Yeah.
Or somebody who's a person of color who already walks the streets day to day and already has fear for their life when
Mhm.
interacting with law enforcement, for example. I'm
Mhm.
not just trying to villainize anybody, but I also want to just acknowledge that very real fear. So then, on top of walking around and
Yeah.
having that be your everyday reality, and
Yeah.
then you're violated, or you grew up being violated for years and years of your childhood, and now you have to continue walking with that on top of the very real fears that are happening in the current day.
Yeah.
So that's
Mhm.
just so important. And imagine you're both, all of those things, the
All of those things at
intersectionality,
once. Yeah.
like that's so much for one person to take.
Yeah.
And
It
so
is.
just the grief of not being able to
Mhm.
live a carefree life
Mhm.
anymore.
Yeah, it's a really good way to put it. Grief of, yeah, again, that grief of safety, right?
Hmm.
Um, Using creative somatic and narrative interventions to process nonverbal grief. We could probably also talk about this for hours and hours, right? Shannon, but not always do we have the words or language to describe our experience, right? But maybe we can write about it. Or maybe we can share a piece of art that conveys what we're experiencing. Maybe there's a song that we can, share that really hits home. So I think we have to be expansive in the ways that we support, right, survivors. And that can include expressive arts and creativity, and I think in very profound ways.
Absolutely. And thinking about narrative, for example, like we like to talk about in the counseling world, like externalizing the internal and
Yeah.
imagining, like we were talking about earlier, the shame that someone
Mhm.
might feel. Writing a letter to our shame
Yeah.
so that our shame is not in our body anymore,
Hmm.
that we
Hmm.
can
Yeah.
externalize our shame so that we don't identify as our shame and we can recognize it as a separate entity
Mhm.
and not to disregard it, but to be removed
Yeah.
from it
Hmm.
is just one example of
Yeah. It's a
I
powerful example. Yeah.
Kaylee's the expressive arts master though, so I'm sure. Can you name
No.
maybe an art-based example?
Yeah. Well, I'm even thinking, Shannon, as you're describing that externalization of shame, maybe you draw what shame looks like, give it a voice. What would it say? Right. And I think sometimes that just dials down the intensity of that emotion, right? When we can, like Shannon's saying, externalize it. So yeah, well said, my friend.
Thank
I'm just
you.
kind of keeping my eyeball on time for us. So let's
Yep,
keep
we've
chugging
got
along.
our
Again,
key takeaways. I
perfect.
don't mind
Perfect.
reading a couple of these.
Awesome. Yeah. We can divide and conquer.
All right, you want to take the first two?
I'm sure. So this is unfortunately a pervasive problem, right? Sexual violence is globally pervasive. Survivors encounter various negative impacts, including this maybe new term for folks, disenfranchised grief, right? Again, that grief that gets, I say, swept under the rug. I'll
Hmm.
let you take the
And
next one there.
those facing disenfranchised grief can experience a myriad of things, as Kaylee went over, but some of those things are lack of support, fear of judgment, which can lead to distress or cause additional distress, and struggles with relational and sexual safety.
Mhm.
We know, as clinicians at least, that it's so common for people who are sexually violated to experience additional victimization, whether that's additional sexual violation, domestic violence, um, being continuously exposed because of boundaries and trust being broken and not knowing how to rebuild from there. And when you don't have the support, that doesn't lead you to success, so to speak. And so thinking about how clinicians and really all helping professionals and all friends, family of anyone who's at risk or has been violated in this way, we can aid survivors by validating their grief and loss, supporting reclamation, externalization, and incorporating client-centered interventions that we can help verbally and non-verbally process grief with survivors. So this is our contact information, our emails. We're friendly people. We'd love to chat and
We don't
connect.
bite. We don't bite, right? No.
We don't, and we love collaboration.
Mhm.
So
We
please feel
do.
free to reach out,
Absolutely.
and here are our lovely references. And that is what we've got.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.